Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to present my work in progress. As you say, I have lots of passions, and one of those is environmental economics. So by training, I'm an environmental economist and an econometrician, but then I love to work on every policy relevant topic that that might be interesting. So let me share the screen, and please let me know if you see it okay, because I don't see your faces anymore when I put the full screen, I guess. So far.
We can see it.
Perfect. So just interrupt me whenever you have any question, because I might not see your hands raised. Okay. So this paper is about quantitative. It's about quantifying informality. Informality is, by its very nature, very hard to quantify and address with policies. And on the other side, there is irregular migration that provides new people willing to work informally and increases the competition with formal workers, especially in sectors characterized by large demands of unskilled workers, so substitutable workers and seasonal workers, such as agriculture, construction, and services. So let me motivate a little bit this paper, which might seem a little bit unconventional, but is aimed to be a labor paper, a labor economics paper. The informal sector, where irregular migrants are overrepresented, employs over 60% of the world's working population. So given this, a big question arises. So how can we detect and quantify the impact of irregular migration on informal employment? Estimation is difficult due to lack of data on both populations, right? So we cannot observe informality by definition, and neither irregular migrants, so migrants that are undocumented, not registered, do not have a legal status in a country. So previous studies, the most famous might be the Warren and Passell and Borjas recently developed methods to estimate the number of irregular migrants from census data and analyze their labor market impact. Yet the effects of irregular migration on firms remain so far unexplored. And several important questions arise. For instance, which firms are more likely to employ informal workers after a migration shock? And what are the economic implications on formal employment, consumer prices, firm profits, and tax evasion? I focus in this paper on agriculture for many reasons. So one is that it's highly characterized by informal labor and a large demands for unskilled, ready available seasonal workers. And so about 1/3 of Europe's agricultural workers are informal. And this is especially the case as well for Italy, but Italy has similar informality rates as other countries, also Austria, in terms of informality in agriculture. One specificity of Italian agriculture is that it employs a lot of European irregular migrants because of geographic reasons as well, so 5 to 10%. And it's estimated that the value that irregular migrants produce and informal work from irregular migrants produce in Italy is 1 point of the GDP. And overall, irregular migration and informality pose some welfare concerns and financial concerns, of course, because they generate tax evasion, so losses to national revenue, so to public good provision, but also competition, so substitution with formal workers, and problems related to work labor exploitation and overall welfare in the population. And in this paper specifically, I propose, so we, with my co-authors, propose a new way to quantify informal employment induced by irregular migration, and we identify farms that misreport. What do we use? So I use the exogenous variation from a large and unexpected migration shock, in particular the 2011 Arab Spring wave on southern Italian coasts. And I combine, so I use this exogenous variation from the shock combined with rich farm level data on Italian vineyards. So I focus on vineyards in all Italian regions. And I can control for a large set of farm and weather variables that capture specificities of what is the product of vineyards, so grapes. So about 400 variables, especially capturing different weather conditions that might determine differences across farms and farms products. For 3 years, 2010, where the migration wave was not there, and then 2011 and 2012. And the identification strategy will rely on this exogenous shock being observed in 2011 and 12, having potential effects in these years. So it's a sort of an intent to treat analysis. So that might have some effects in especially the landing regions. And I will use machine learning to predict farm outcomes. In 2010, in absence of the shock, I will estimate a function that maps characteristics of these farms into an outcome that would be labor productivity. And I will use this function that I can estimate with high accuracy in unexposed time periods, so periods without the shock, in order to predict what would have happened in these farms had the shock not been there. So I will use this as a counterfactual. I will then define or identify misreporting as statistically significant deviations of predicted outcomes from observed outcomes. So the predicted outcomes using the pre-shock function from observed outcomes in the regions that absorb the shock or potentially absorb the shocks. And then I will estimate the distributional effects of informal employment on consumer surplus. So I will look at whether this has any effect on prices. For sure, hiring informally reduces the cost for a firm. So you might think that prices might go down, so it might benefit consumers. And it might increase profits, perhaps also for differences in labor cost or revenues. And then I will also give an estimate of losses to national revenues caused by the 2011 shock. Okay, so here is the whole summary of what this paper does. And then I will go now step by step into first background. So what is this 2011 Arab Spring migrant wave, and then to the data, and finally to the methods and results. So the 2011 Arab Spring immigration to southern Italy occurred especially through the so-called Central Mediterranean route and the Apulia and Calabria route. And mostly brought people from Tunisia and refugees already in Libya to the southern Italian coast. It was an unexpected wave, especially large, so the largest actually experienced so far by Italy, Italian coast, and it brought about 64,000 of detected migrants, so detected illegal border crossing, so undocumented people landing, especially in the islands, here, southern of Sicily. And then migrants were relocated to the different harbors, especially in Sicily and in Puglia. The majority of migrants arrived in the first half of the year, so 50,000 compared to about 4,000 the year before. And of these 64,000 landed migrants, about 55,000 were recorded then at the hotspots that are these first aid emergency centers after relocation from the islands. And in these first aid centers also there is evidence that 12,000 then disappeared from the counting. So there is evidence of migrants that were not anymore in the first aid emergency centers. So the wave, as I said, was largely unexpected. Italy declared the state of emergency because it required a lot of resources to manage the incoming migrants, especially for health reasons and for identification reasons. The thing is that in Italy, traveling immediately after landing is quite hard, because in Italy, different from other parts of Europe, irregular migration is a crime, is a penal crime, is not an administrative crime, and is punished with detention and expulsion at some point. So overall, there are incentives of these migrants to avoid the camps and work in an initial phase to for money and documents to reach then the farther destination. Italy is not the end destination typically of these migrants. And this system in Italy in agriculture is called caporalato, which is a young master system that matches the demand for cheap labor and a large amount of labor, especially in the harvesting season in September, October, by farms to the supply of a lot of people willing to make easy money, I mean, working hard, but with making money without having documents, so without being legally registered. And this phenomenon is quite big. So it seems that more than 400,000 people, informal workers, are part of this system in agriculture. Okay. Identification. So I will use labor productivity defined as the quantity, so the tons of grapes divided by the hours, reported labor hours by the farms. And I will identify then misreporting from a change. So underreporting will cause the hours to be lower than expected. So it will lead to abnormal increases in labor productivity. So the idea is that labor productivity, differently than just quantities or differently than hours, is quite constant and easy to predict with machine learning methods. For instance, if you have a lot of farm characteristics, so inputs and weather variables, typically labor productivity, which is in unskilled sectors, is quite easy to predict. And then once you can show that labor productivity is an easy to predict outcome, you can then infer the underreporting of the hours from abnormally large gaps between observed and estimated labor productivity after the shock. If farms underreport also the quantity, this is quite unlikely because typically the quantity is sold wholesale to the markets, to the supermarkets, to the local markets. But if that would happen, is a lower bound. However, we claim that this is not something that happens typically because they would also get much lower prices to sell grapes in an informal market. So there is also no informal market for grapes per se. And it was very short term. So the quantity could be considered as fixed once you control for farm inputs and weather. And there is a literature from Laporta and Schleifer, for instance, that are doing a lot of research on informality and labor productivity of informal work. So for jobs with negligible returns on experience, so unskilled jobs, the labor productivity of formal and informal is typically the same because of high substitutability. So if one worker one day shows less productivity, then the day after seems that he's replaced by another worker. So because of the high substitutability between workers, we can think that the two productivities are the same, and that's what we assume. If it would not be the case because of effort, fatigue, exploitation, then what I would give you here would be considered a lower bound. Okay, so these are some of the assumptions. So that the vineyard labor is substitutable, and that there is no effect of the migration shock on other fixed components of the farm. And this is plausible because the migration shock was sudden and unexpected. So in the short term, this is, I would say, a plausible assumption. And the third is that there are no other shocks of irregular migrants in other regions different than the landing regions where these migrants arrived. So here I show also in the paper, now for the interest of time, I will not show you in detail, but asylum seekers were relocated according to the population, and they were not many relocated in 2011 and 12. Most migrants were just waiting to be identified and to, or they were put in detention centers in the landing regions. So there were no other regions that absorbed a lot of migrants that could then work informally in other regions. About asylum seekers, they also receive a pay in Italy. When you ask for asylum, you are well treated, so not optimally, but you receive a pay. And if you are caught doing some informal labor or whatever criminal activity, you lose immediately your right to obtain any asylum. So they don't have that incentives. But through a battery of robustness checks, or leave one out estimation, this can be also assessed somehow empirically. Okay, so these are my main identification assumptions. And the data set, as I mentioned, our farm level data come from the FADN that you are very well aware of. And the agro-meteorological data come from AgriForecast. We can consider the treated units as potentially treated all farms in Sicily and Apulia after the shock. And this gives us a sample of about 3,000 vineyards with weights. So this farm accountancy data network contains some weights that for every farm is reflecting how representative, how many farms in the sector these farms represents. Okay. And in terms of model specification, I put in everything I have in terms of inputs, type of farms, type of grapes that farms are producing, altitude, weather, and so on. Let me see how, okay. So here is quickly just a difference in mean between the amount of grapes before and after in the treated farms and in the control farms, so all other farms in Italy. And you see that in terms of quantities on average, there is not a big effect. There is a reduction in labor hours for treated farms and not such a reduction, actually an increase for control farms. But then the question of this paper is how much of this change actually can be attributed to the shock, and what are the characteristics of the farms that actually exhibit these significant effects. Okay, so I will skip this in the interest of time, and I will give you to go to my empirical strategy. So the methodology hinges on having a good predictor for untreated outcomes, right? So outcomes in absence of a migration shock. So my idea was to predict labor productivity using a machine learning tool, which is called SuperLearner, which seems fancy, but it's just a combination of different machine learning algorithms, and it works like that. So it obtains prediction, y hat, using, for instance, Lasso, which is a quite standard machine learning algorithm. So it's a penalized regression method, boosting, random forest, neural networks, and so on. So we obtain different predictions using different methods. And then the SuperLearner averages out the predictions using a standard regression. So as a regressor, it will be the predictions from the different algorithms, and the coefficients in this way will represent how well the labor productivity estimated by Lasso, how well it reflects the true labor productivity that is put as a dependent variable on the left-hand side. Okay, and then the fitted value of this second stage will be my final labor productivity predictions. And this is shown that putting together different machine learning methods typically gives a better performance than just using an individual method based on what you think it could be the best method for that. And then I simply compute the residual, so the y minus y hat, so the gaps. And I compute the gaps in normal times, and I compute the gaps in the time where the shock took place, and I compare what happened. Okay, and then in order to understand whether each gap that I estimate for farms in the landing region, whether this gap is abnormal, so it could be noise, right? It could be that some farms, for the farm Marica and for the farm Marica in the north and Marica in the south is very similar farms. I might estimate actually a very noisy, gap. But in that sense, I will have to match similar farms and compare the gaps of similar farms in order to understand how much of this gap is noise and how much of this gap is actually abnormal or statistically different than noise. And for this, I use a data-driven matching estimator called causal forest. Okay. And in this way, I can also understand the characteristics of the farms that misreport the most, because I will have an individualized prediction of abnormal labor productivity for every farm. So I can then just look at the characteristics of the farms with the largest gaps. Okay, and in the paper, we also developed a way to do inference that is robust to misspecification and multiple hypothesis testing. So we have also some methodological contribution in terms of how to do inference, so understand whether these gaps are statistically significant or not, the uncertainty around them. Okay, so as I mentioned, I will compute the residual outcome, so the gap for each farm. And then what I expect is that before migration, I will not expect an error. So the mean square error between of the treated and untreated will be close to 0. So if I can estimate that with high accuracy, I will have a close to 0 error. And that's what I find. I find 98% accuracy. And I find similar distribution between the gaps of the treated units and the gaps of the untreated. After shock, in absence of other technological or labor market shock in 2011 and 12, I will instead observe a larger error, so on average in the treated units, and both on average and in terms of distribution. So I will observe a shift to the right of the distribution of the gaps, so larger gaps, larger errors, residuals. And instead for the untreated farms, I will still expect no difference between the gaps before in 2010 and the gaps exposed in 2011 and 12. Okay. And then I can also check whether running an OLS on a regression of the residuals on the treatment dummy, I can have an idea of the average effect of the average, how much the average gap for the treated units is larger than the gap for the untreated units. And then a bunch of robustness tests, as I mentioned. Okay, so for the untreated data, so for the untreated farms and treated farms before 2010, I find, well, I split the data set into training set and test set because I want to assess the accuracy out of sample, so generalizable to any data set that was not used for training, so for estimating the function. And I achieve, as I mentioned, 98% of accuracy in predicting labor productivity in Sicily and Apulia in 2010. And there is also no difference in terms of distribution. After the shock, instead, I show that the gaps for the treated farms are statistically greater than the gaps for the untreated farms using different tests. And here is, I averaged the error, so the squared, I computed the mean squared gap, 4 farms in Sicily, 4 farms in Puglia. Calabria is white because there are no economically relevant vineyards in Calabria. It's not a wine region, so I don't have data for that. And then you see that how larger were the gaps on average in Sicily and Apulia compared to the rest of Italy. And then which of these gaps were statistically significant? Well, so here is on average, they were 21% larger. And which of these gaps were statistically significant? Well, 80% of these gaps were statistically significant. So not for all farms in Sicily and Apulia. And here I plot the distribution of the increase, so of the abnormal part of the gap, right? So of the portion of the gap that was not considered as just noise or measurement error. And here you see that for every farm, it ranges from a few percent, on average is this 21%, and then it could go up until 60%. So this is the effects on the labor productivity gaps. Economically, they don't have any meaning, right? So, and then I will have to transform these increases in labor productivity gaps into hours. And I can do this with a simple mathematical computation, with a back-of-the-envelope calculation. But before that, although I think I have, 4 minutes maybe, before that, I want to show you the characteristics of the farms associated to the largest gaps. So who are the farms with small effects on labor productivity here, and who are the farms with large effects here? Who in the sense of which characteristics they have. because the data is anonymized, so I cannot geolocate them, fortunately or unfortunately. This yeah. So I find that so in the paper I show that I have a model in mind of misreporting, so of hiring someone informally. This depends on the incentives that you have, on how much revenues you can make out of it, and on the probability of detection. So here, a negative sign on vineyard land shows that misreporting was higher for small farms, was higher also for farms that have more crops, so that use more land, a higher share of land for crops, so they are more labor intense, so they require more labor than having, for instance, forest or mushrooms or areas for other purposes. I find that informal employment is higher for higher altitude farms, so farms that are a little bit farther away, right? So this correlates with lower probability of being detected if you are at higher altitudes. And interestingly, I find that higher misreporting is present in farms producing high quality wine, this protected denomination of origin. So when the product you produce is more valuable, then your marginal income from misreporting is higher, and your incentive therefore is higher. Okay. And as you see also R-square wise, we're explaining quite a lot with the characteristic, quite a lot of the heterogeneity that you observe here with the characteristics of the farms. And this I do with a lasso regression in order to identify those variables that are important and shrink all the coefficients of the unimportant variables to zero. Okay, so I can translate the gaps into increases in hours. And here is some histograms of the unreported hours on the left and unreported workers. For worker, I assume a 60-day, 8-hour full-time worker in agriculture, so something standard that doesn't take into account the fact that workers can be exploited, but I wanted to have a standardized or conventional estimate. So on average, farms misreport about 200 hours per year or 0.3 full-time workers, meaning 1 in 3 farms misreport. That's how I would interpret that. Misreports 1 worker. 1 in 3 farms misreport 1 worker. Of course, in terms of hours, makes more sense. Workers assume a certain amount of, relies on an assumption of a 60-day, 8-hour per day working time. Okay, then using the weights that I have in order to aggregate these hours, I can have estimates at the sector level. And so I find a total of 11 million unreported hours, which corresponds, this might be interesting as a figure, the share of unreported hours over reported hours is 6%. And informal workers are about 6% in 2011 and 4% in 2012 compared to the formal workers. And this matches also with formal workers reported by official statistics, so not by my sample. Assuming a minimum agricultural wages, I can estimate a 75 million euros of unpaid income taxes and social contributions caused by this specific shock. So this is just an estimate for this specific shock of Arab Spring migrants. And then, sorry if I'm a bit quick on this, but that would be my last result. I decompose the effects on farms' profits, standardized by assets, and then I decompose the effect on profits into an effect on sales and cost. And then I decompose the effect of cost, on labor cost and other cost. And then I look at prices and on hourly wages. So here I use residualized regression method. So I take into account about the selection that I estimated also before, right? So certain farms are more inclined to hire someone informally. So taking into account about this selection process, then I estimate that for those farms in the landing regions, the informal hiring led to 6.6 points increase in profits, in profitability. And this you see here is on effects on sales and prices or quantities is 0, is mainly driven by lower labor cost, okay, as expected per se. And this is reflected by labor cost and not to other costs. I find no effects on prices and a very small effect on wages, because wages are already very close to the minimum, so you cannot declare much lower than the minimum. The effect on prices can be explained by the fact that many firms are price takers because they sell wholesale, and some firms, they have high quality grapes, and you typically are a monopolist on those special grapes for doing exceptional wine, for instance. So you prefer to write contracts and then you set the price, and that's probably why in this sector there might not be effects on prices. So to conclude, I estimate 11 million unreported hours or 23,000 informal workers that were caused and were increased after the 2011 migrant wave that brought a large number of irregular migrants, putting competition, increasing competition with formal workers in the regions of Sicily and Apulia, where they landed. And this especially in small farms in remote areas and producing high quality grapes. I find that this causes high profits because of lower labor cost, but quantity and prices are rather unaffected. I have an estimate for the losses to national revenues because of informal hiring from this wave. This amounts to 75 million euros. And methodologically, this paper aims to provide a way, an approach that also does not require data on migrants or informal workers, but can be used for developing more effective policies that promote formalization, detection, so sort of forensic analysis on farms or firms in sectors such as agriculture, but also manufacturing, construction, or other sectors. And well, you probably can see the paper online, and here is just a barcode where you can find my paper, which is still work in progress. So thank you so much for the attention, and sorry for being a few minutes late.
Thank you very much, Marica. No, you're not late. We started some minutes late, so you are on time. Was perfect. Thank you very much. Peter, may I give the word directly to you? You could start with the comment before we start with our general discussion. And I'm sure there are some questions in the audience as well, but let's start with you, Peter, okay?
So sure enough, even if we are running late, I think I can probably catch up for most of whatever time we have lost, although we don't know exactly how much it is. I must say my background is one in migration and not so much in methodology. So much of this paper is a methodological. I will be focusing mostly on the migration story there. And just shortly recapitulate and say the way I understood the paper and what it basically does. And basically, the starting point is we have a lot of firms. We can predict labor productivity of firms. So we can build a counterfactual relatively easy for any type of shock that we would like to construct. And agricultural data is wonderful. France may want to come in on that, but you know the color of the grape, you know pretty much anything you want to know. And then the idea is basically to say, okay, and then I construct a counterfactual, and any differences in mean squared error or in prediction between the treated and the untreated group are basically interpreted as a result of illegal migration. And lo and behold, we find that this actually takes place. One little point I wanted to know, and this is the other thing, we find that firms are there are certain firms, we can predict the firms that have a high prediction error. One little note I wanted to make is that in the economics of corruption, we very often do tests where we look at certain things happening, and if they happen at random, we should not be able to predict them. So the very fact that you can actually predict which firms you have a prediction error, to me, strengthens very much your argument that you are identifying something. Yeah. I can only do it. I cannot give you the references. I tried to get the references in. I'm so old and I heard all this so long ago that I sometimes have problems to find it. But one paper I remember goes on license plates, where you get low numbers of license plates. So you should not be able to predict the license plates, but we can predict that by the type of car. Expensive cars very often have nice license plates, yeah, and all these kinds of things. And so I would maybe use that, look a little bit into that literature on corruption to even strengthen your argument. Of course, the next step, you logically, so we know there's something going on there. And the next step you do is then you say, okay, and it must be migration. Yeah. And there, again, I know very little about the data you use, and I know very little about the institutional setups. There are plenty of robustness checks for all kinds of things. So you got me. I'm pretty much convinced. Yeah. But my suggestion there would be to inform a little bit more about the incentives both of the migrants, which I think you do very, very well, to register for employment, but also the incentives of the vineyards. Yeah. And just I would like to know how high are the taxes and et cetera, et cetera. Also, I wondered a little bit, sort of in the Austrian system, what you would have is that these people would very strongly say they are refugees. Yeah, they would claim refugee status. So one way out is, of course, to move into the refugee status. And I was wondering whether what this is. Are we really looking at people who fled from the camp? So is it really the camp fleeing people, or is it people in addition that were never detected that you believe are coming in there? Also, the point on again, this is my ignorance of the data. Of course, we want to have data where firms report as they would want to report to the tax office. So I was wondering a little bit from your data descriptions, are there any reasons, if you interview firms, they may be more honest. So the genesis of that data has to be very clearly made. So basically what I'm saying, I would have loved to read a little bit more about the institutional background there. Then come your identification assumptions, which again you test and do all kinds of things. Again, I'm complaining at a very high level here. But one minor point, I wonder what happens you're saying that if they are perfect substitutes, then your estimate is fine. If they're imperfect substitutes, then this is a lower bound estimate. I wonder what happens if they are complements. Here, I would need to know a little bit more about the production process in agriculture. So could I imagine, for instance, that by employing a refugee, that the native Italians working on the farm go into the shop at the vineyard because that requires language, and the harvesting is then done, and I free some harvesting labor to do high productivity or more language. So I was wondering a little bit, sort of whether your estimate would be sensitive to the degree of substitutionality and complementarity between the two types of labor, native and sort of illegal or informal. I guess your definition of informality basically just means not reported to the tax authorities, or is it not social security? That may be a little bit of that would be a difference in the Austrian system. It may be the same in Italy. What I really, really like about the paper is so it's a great paper. It's a good, it got me. I think you have a very convincing way to show that that something is going on in those firms. And I also buy the story that it's going to be migration, because it's hard to believe that something like that of that size could happen at the same time. But what I really liked about it is its potential for further research, because now you have a good predictor of, or a credible predictor of, how much informality has changed. You have an exogenous event, and now you can look at that. You can think of the effects on native wages. You can think of all kinds of causal inferences that you could do in further work on that. And actually, I would be extremely interested to read that work. You can even think of things that happen within firms. So there is I see a huge variety of further applications, how you can use your estimates for other tasks. And as I said, I'm looking forward. I thank you for giving me this paper to read, and I'm looking forward to the many others that hopefully follow from that. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Great points and great comments. Yeah, luckily it's recorded, so I can also go back to the video. Should I reply to a few things, or we?
Yes, perhaps just very shortly, if I may ask you to do that, because
no, I many points are well taken, especially, for instance, about the institutional setup. I give you an idea of 75 million euros in terms of missed social contributions, but I could have an estimate per farm, so I could give an idea of per farm, so to have a better. That's a great idea that you gave me. In terms of refugee status, so something that I didn't have the time to go through is that, so this wave didn't bring a lot of Syrians. Was a wave where especially economic migrants arrived to Italy. So mainly were sub-Saharan Africans that were in Libya waiting to leave. And then there was the war, Gaddafi was overthrown, and they used the relaxation of the controls to escape and come to Italy. So officially, most of these migrants would not have any international protection or refugee status because, for instance, migrants from Senegal, in Senegal, there was no specific war or no specific political. So that's why in the paper I make an example of Gambia, because Gambia was, instead, they had some political tension. And if you were saying that you were from Gambia, you were more likely to get protection. So it was very, very difficult to obtain asylum, and Italy took ages also to arrive to a decision for many migrants. So many were kept in the limbo, and that exactly is this limbo that I cannot really tell whether, were migrants that escaped the earliest detection, or were migrants that escaped the camps, or migrants that were doing back and forth from the camps to the farms, because they are kind of this. Unfortunately, I cannot tell, and I also can tell that the hours that I estimate is accurate with my uncertainty bounds, but in terms of hours might be accurate, but in terms of whether they are substituting the natives or this type of things, I cannot say. I can say that it's informal labor that substitutes formal labor, but it might be that is a native that then goes to the shop, but then who was before in the shop, where it goes, and that's indeed some social security data question that I asked for. So you already anticipated me. The idea is then to have access to social security data and look in these periods what happened, to have an idea of some welfare analysis. So maybe, it's not that it's bad, because maybe natives went to more productive sectors, who knows, right? So you indeed got right, and definitely there are more avenues for exploring, and thanks for all the other comments that you made, but these were my main responses so far.
Agnes, can I just, for clarification, because maybe I was a little bit unclear on that. So yeah, thanks for the response. I think there must be a difference from your response between the Austrian system and the Italian system in refugee status, because rationally, the first thing an illegal migrant, when detected, would do in Austria is to say, political refugee, irrespective of the chances of this, because after this, there comes a long process of being allowed to be in the country. And even in that area, you could have black market activities, but the person is legally in Austria. But of course, they are in camps, etc. But they move outside, and there is that. But the primary incentive would be to say, I'm a refugee. Yeah? And of course, other countries have other institutional things. Some are much faster in deciding about non-chance. If you have no chance, you come from a safe third country, you're very quickly taken out. No? It also depends a little bit on the generosity of the system, of the asylum system. So how much do they get? And the second point is, I was trying to construct to find at least some point where I can weaken the paper, a case where the arrival of migrants in a farm actually leads to an increase in productivity of the natives. Yeah. Causally, this would be through specialization. And I'm not sure, because I don't feel safe completely, but my feeling is that in that case, you would overestimate the effect of migration. And this is basically a technological thing, because, if it's just picking grapes from in the vineyard, then I don't really see how there can be specialization. But if there are sort of, if you have I think they're called agroturismo, and you do the more language-bound things, and you specialize labor within this thing, then there could be such an effect. And it would be nice if somewhere you could rule that out too.
Yeah, this related to the complementarity that you were mentioning before. Yeah, this is a great point. Yes, okay. I will think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. So I myself would have some comments as well, but I see Franz, please. Go on.
Yeah, Thank you very much for this presentation. And to be honest, there are some elements that are totally new to me. So I will need more effort to understand what's going on there. So my questions are related to data, and maybe one thing I didn't really get. So you have the farms, they are in FADN, and you have vineyards. Each farm has several vineyards, and you can map the vineyards to the farms.
I have one data point. Every farm has some hectares, and they have hectares for grapes or for forest or for, so I know which type of crop is in every, but these are those defined in as vineyards by the European system, that I think is they have, you know, more than 90% of the land dedicated to growing grapes. So
Okay, you have farms and they have hectares of vineyards, and
exactly.
You assume they're close to the farm.
Exactly. So I don't have the difference that you have between farmstead or plots. I have one data point for vineyards and the altitude of the farm, of the land. So I don't have multiple altitudes related to the same. I have just one measure. That's what FADN gives at the most granular level that they give this data. So this is data that still you have to ask, takes about a year after you ask for them. So it's not publicly available data, but that's the best they give you from Europe.
Yeah, thank you. And another question. If I understood you correctly, one assumption is that farms that benefit from informal labor are underreporting the hours. And now I'm wondering, why should a farm underreport hours but report profits correctly?
Yeah, so this is something that I thought at the beginning, and then I thought there is a way to test it per se. So there could be, so I don't find any effects on prices, any effects on quantities. The idea is that the quantities that you have on your trees are given, especially if it's, you know, you already, the growing season was over. So the grapes that are there, and we're focusing on a market in which you don't have a big illegal market for grapes. As I mentioned, you go wholesale, and then you have also some contracts to respect and to fulfill. So you have to give a given amount of grapes to other producers. So I don't find effects on quantities and on prices. Then you can misreport or other costs that for some reasons it might match up, but I don't find any other effects in other labor costs. I only find effects on this so in the part of the cost that are labor costs. In other costs, I don't find effects. So either they were really strategic and really good at hiding things, but then if they were really good at hiding things, why would they underreport labor, right? So my idea was that you could you benefit from a supply of migrants, and then you report only some of them, and those who are not paid legally, you just don't report them because of the short-term effects. Yeah, so that would be my response. It's because I don't find effects on prices or effects on quantities are not so likely. But in other sectors, that's a very plausible question. So why then the effects? So why you would report other statistics correctly, depending on how big is the shock or how sudden is the shock and which type of shock, then you might also think that this might not be plausible. Yeah, well, that's a good point.
Thank you very much. Benjamin, you have another comment or question?
Yeah, so thank you first for this very interesting paper. I have one question concerning the assessment of the magnitude of your effect that you found. So you mentioned that 23,000 informal workers you think worked in that sector. In the beginning, you said that about 60,000 people arrived. So to me, that seems that's quite big, because what we normally hear that people will move north, so they would like to go to rich European countries like Germany, or if you mentioned a lot of people from Senegal, so they might have connections in France. They want to go to France to people they know there. So to me, it seems like a pretty big estimate. Do you have any idea about this?
Yeah, so first I have the agricultural ministry, so the Ministry for Agriculture and Frontex together, they estimate that the actual size of the migrant wave was much bigger than the detected 64,000 landings. So you might expect that there were every 10 minutes, there were boats of people arriving continuously in between March and April. So it seems that there were a lot of people who were not even detected. They just left. Indeed, a lot of Tunisians went to France, that's for sure. And they were also, so there were migrants that probably contributed to this pressure on the formal labor market that were not recorded. Also remember that my estimates in terms of people, rely, so the hours is 6%. So there is a 6% increase in informality compared to formality, which might not seem as big, right, for one big wave. But the number of migrants relies on the assumption of a 60-day, 8 hours season. So it might be that instead one migrant is working on close by farms. So then the number of migrants would reduce. I don't claim that my estimate of the number of migrants is accurate. Is accurate under the assumption that I make. But I could also maybe provide another estimate, much smaller, if I would assume that either one migrant is working many more hours, right? Which might also be the case if you're a bit exploited. But maybe I can also give another estimate just to have an idea of what a lower bound estimate could be. But so what you should think about plausible, so the most plausible is the hours that are actually underreported. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marica, one last question from myself. Do you have addresses of the vineyards?
No, unfortunately, they were anonymized.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So you just have the county, but not any more detailed information on the geographical position.
The altitude that allows me somehow to detect those are a bit more remote farms.
Yeah. Okay.
But unfortunately, no, they will not give. I ask, but especially for this type of paper that is not about estimating the climate change impact on farms, but it's about detecting farms. They are not really happy also to, I think, go into this direction of de-anonymize my data.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any last comments or questions which are pressing at the moment? No. Okay, then thank you very much, Marica, for your presentation. It was really interesting. We were so happy to have you here today. And thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And I wish you a nice afternoon.